In May 1940, the French army was considered the best in the world. It had almost 3 million men, approximately 4,000 tanks, and 3,000 state-of-the-art aircraft. On the other side of the border, Adolf Hitler's Germany was preparing to launch its ambitious campaign of conquest. Many believed that the conflict would develop into long and exhausting battles, as had happened in the First World War. But the Nazi forces surprised everyone when, in just 6 weeks, they completely destroyed the French, along with the rest of their allies. But how did the Germans win so effectively and quickly?
The Germans, they were always up there, they were always pushing, they were always scaring people. And you never quite knew how and where to read that.
Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will answer this question. Stay with us to understand how the best army on the planet fell so quickly to the overwhelming Nazi forces. After conquering Poland on October 6, 1939, Adolf Hitler already had his hungry eyes on his next target, France. When he informed his generals which country would be invaded next, most of them became alarmed. The French would not be as easy to defeat as the Polish soldiers. They were a professional, experienced, and very numerous army, considered by many to be one of the best in Europe. They also had the Maginot Line, a series of defensive fortifications along the entire Franco-German border, which was considered impenetrable. Worse still for the Germans, this time they would not have the element of surprise. The risk of their forces being crushed immediately was very high. Hitler, however, was not intimidated and ordered his generals to begin planning the offensive. But his ambition went much further. Not only was France to fall, Belgium and the Netherlands had to suffer the same fate. And it was essential that all three nations be attacked in a single operation. Thus, the United Kingdom would be left as Germany's only rival, cut off from any kind of help. At first, the commanders of the Nazi forces proposed a plan similar to the one the German Empire had used during the First World War, to enter France through the Belgian Ardennes forest, and there face its enemy. But the Führer rejected this idea outright. He did not want a repeat of the previous conflict, since it had ended with the German defeat. Instead, he wanted to take advantage of one of the strong points of his army, the armored divisions. By 1939, most European countries had tanks and similar vehicles in their forces, but most of them had not updated the way they used them since the years of the Great War. They served simply as support for infantry units, without any independence on the battlefield. The Third Reich, however, had other ideas in mind, ideas that it was eager to show to the whole world. The plans for the conquest of Western Europe underwent so many changes that they were only approved on February 24, 1940, almost 5 months after the initial discussions. The final operation became known as the Yellow Plan and was devised primarily by General Erich von Manstein.
Their plan calls for 10 panzer divisions to charge west across a 400-kilometer front, with the main attack driving through the Ardennes forest. Their goal: surprise, divide, and destroy the Allies. The hilly, rugged Ardennes is considered poor terrain for tanks. Here, heavy armor can get bogged down in the deep woods and gullies. It's one of the most unlikely places for a panzer attack, and for that reason, it's perfect.
The German forces would be divided in two. Army Corps B would attack through northern Holland and Belgium. When the Allies sent their fighters to meet them, Army Corps A would enter through the Ardennes and surround them from the south, then head towards the ocean. In this way, the enemies of the Reich would be completely cornered, and the Maginot Line would be completely outflanked. It was an ambitious plan, with a high probability of catastrophe. The tanks would have to move through mountainous and wooded terrain, with little chance of air cover. The vehicles would be forced to move very close to each other and could easily fall victim to an Allied offensive. This side, for its part, was fully confident in its defensive capabilities. The British and French also expected the main German attack to come from the north, to avoid the Maginot Line. As for the Ardennes, they thought it was simply impenetrable, so there was no reason to send forces there. But even before the German offensive began, fractures within the Allies were beginning to appear. Belgium and the Netherlands, thinking they could still prevent Hitler from invading, did not allow the forces of the United Kingdom and France to enter their territories, seeking not to provoke the Führer. In doing so, they forced the Western powers to abandon the initiative and only attack if they were attacked first. The Allied armies included almost 4 million men, who were positioned on the border between France and the Netherlands. Not only did they outnumber Germany, which mobilized its approximately 3 million soldiers, but they also outnumbered it in vehicles, technology, and experience, or at least that is what they thought. Finally, the day came. On May 10, 1940, the same day Winston Churchill took office as British Prime Minister, the German army launched its Yellow Plan. Army Corps B crossed the border with Holland and Belgium en masse, destroying everything in its path. The small Dutch forces could do little to stop the advance of the Reich. By the time the French crossed the border, their allies' men were in retreat. On May 14th, already displaying the brutality that would bring them infamy, the Germans mercilessly bombed the city of Rotterdam, killing approximately 800 civilians. The next day, frightened by this unprecedented slaughter, the Dutch government announced its surrender. The Belgian forces, which now had some French reinforcements, were able to temporarily slow down the German tanks, but the Allies were unable to take advantage of this situation. The huge number of civilians fleeing the battlefields greatly hampered their advance, and the opportunity for a counteroffensive disappeared. The outlook was not encouraging. Many of their generals were realizing that they had seriously underestimated their enemy, and things were about to get worse. While the Germans, French, and Belgians fought fiercely in the north, the German Army Corps A began its advance through the Ardennes. The few Allied forces there proved completely unable to stop the onslaught of Hitler's battleships. They did not think it was possible for hundreds of tanks to break through such dense vegetation, so they had no defenses capable of stopping them. With the death toll mounting rapidly, they had to retreat back to the cities of northern France. The Allied generals were bitterly surprised. Their vehicles were superior in armor and weapons to the relatively weak German panzers, yet they were dropping like flies, along with an alarming number of soldiers. They could not understand the reason, but in reality, it was very simple. The French and British saw the tanks as mere support units. In contrast, the Germans had made the battleships a key part of their new doctrine of Blitzkrieg, or as they called it.
The world was staggered by the speed with which the German armored columns moved. What was the secret that enabled armies to move so far so rapidly? The secret lay in the organization of the striking spearhead. Armored forces came first, closely followed by motorized divisions, which peeled off, forming solid walls. And through the corridor thus formed, raced the supply trucks to feed the ever-lengthening column.
Added to this innovative tactic was the chaos caused by the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. Its planes relentlessly attacked Allied supply columns, destroying much of their resources and killing hundreds of their men. The morale of many French soldiers collapsed as they saw themselves vastly outnumbered by their enemy. It was common for entire divisions to retreat, despite not being ordered to do so, or even some to desert. The generals demanded that the British send more forces, since at that time there was only the expeditionary force in continental Europe, which had no armored divisions. But in London, more and more voices declared that France was already lost, and that Churchill should concentrate on defending the local territory. Only a few units were dispatched, but they would not be enough to face the enemy. The Germans reaped victory after victory. By May 15th, they had positioned themselves south of the Allied forces and began the second phase of their plan. With surprising speed, they began to head towards the French coast, with the aim of completely surrounding their rivals. The German tanks were capable of covering hundreds of kilometers in a single day. The French forces, seeing the clouds of dust caused by the armored battalions, lost all hope and ability to organize. The Nazi vehicles barely slowed down to confront them, as with just a few cannon shots they were capable of causing a massive retreat. On the 20th of May, the Germans reached the beaches of the English Channel, a border territory between France and Great Britain. More than 1 million Allied soldiers were trapped in the pincers of the German forces. At that moment, Churchill realized that France was lost. Despite the resentment shown by his partner's generals, he ordered his men to head for the coasts of Dunkirk, where a massive evacuation would take place. He knew that Hitler's next target was the United Kingdom, and he needed every available fighter to mount the defense of his nation. He did not want to sacrifice men in what he saw as a lost cause. It was here that Hitler made one of the most controversial decisions of the entire Second World War. The tanks' good pace, in addition to tiring their crews, had caused them to outnumber the infantry units. For some of the German generals, including Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Corps A, this put their armored divisions in a very vulnerable position for Allied counterattacks. Therefore, he believed that the vehicles should be slowed down. However, other military leaders urged that they should press on and hit their enemies while they were weakened and retreating, before they were able to organize an evacuation. Much to the chagrin of the latter, on 24th May, the Führer ordered a temporary pause in the advance of the tanks. For many historians, this was their biggest mistake, as the Allies had just enough time to begin their escape 2 days later.
Later in the war, Hitler will try to cover up his mistake and say that he wanted to avoid humiliating Britain in view of peace talks. After the war, von Rundstedt will say that Hitler gives the order, but this is a lie. In reality, von Rundstedt gives the order to stop, but tells his subordinates that the order came from Hitler so that they will obey.
British and French ships, and even civilian boats, approached the coast to assist the desperate men, while German planes attacked from the skies. By June 4th, 1940, almost 350,000 soldiers had been rescued. Despite the tens of thousands of casualties sacrificed to ensure the evacuation, the operation was a success. The Allies had the necessary fighters to continue resisting the Third Reich's plans for world domination. For many, if the Germans had not paused their attacks, the war could have ended right there, on the shores of Dunkirk. But although the evacuation was successful, the Allied situation in Europe was disastrous. On May 28th, Belgium had announced its surrender. After Dunkirk, with the British back in the British Isles, the only ones capable of opposing the Nazis were the battered French. But they had lost their best forces in the encirclement, and only their much less experienced reserves remained. They were located south of the German armored divisions, on the Somme and Aisne rivers. If these defenses fell, Paris was at risk of being captured by the invaders. Some attacks caused a large number of casualties among the Germans, including many destroyed tanks. However, they could not stop their advance. On the 5th of June 1940, the Nazis began crossing both rivers to deal the final blow to the already hopeless French. The now united A and B Army Corps headed towards Paris, while the newly formed C Army Corps would attack the forces still defending the Maginot Line. This would prevent possible counterattacks in their rear. The Germans, who had begun their campaign outnumbered, now had almost twice as many divisions as their enemies, due to casualties and evacuations. Villages in the French communes where the Allies were holed up were razed to the ground under the chains and guns of the panzers. The generals of the defenders, knowing that the fate of Paris and their nation was in their hands, ordered their men to fight to the death. The objective was simple: kill as many Nazis as possible before being felled by enemy bullets. For many of them, the war was already lost. The Germans, for their part, used this as an excuse to commit terrible massacres, both of civilians and enemy soldiers.
In some places, the Germans also murder French African colonial soldiers after they've surrendered. In fact, overall in the campaign, SS and Wehrmacht troops kill at least 3,000 French African and nearly 200 British and French prisoners, and several massacres of civilians take place, like at Vinct and WWII. At one of the massacres of African troops, a German officer explains his actions to his French counterpart.
An inferior race does not deserve to fight such a civilizing race as the German race.
Despite fierce local resistance, which caused numerous casualties among the attackers, the German battleships once again outnumbered the French. By June 9th, the Nazis had broken through the defensive lines along almost the entire battlefront. On June 14, 1940, Paris fell. To prevent its destruction, the French forces abandoned the capital entirely. Thus, the invaders entered without resistance, bringing death and barbarism to the city, considered by many to be the most beautiful in the world. On June 25th, the remaining surviving forces signed the armistice that ended the fighting. In just 6 weeks, what had been considered the most powerful army in the world was almost completely destroyed. Approximately 90,000 French soldiers and civilians were killed, while 8 million lost their homes. For some Allied generals, the blame for such a sudden defeat fell on the cowardice of the combatants. Others pointed accusingly at outdated tactics and the incompetence of commanders. They were unable to cope with the strategic advances of the Germans, who combined the explosive action of their tanks with the lethality of their aircraft. The Allies, with their morale at rock bottom, lived their darkest moment. Many already considered that the entire war had been lost on the French fields. Meanwhile, German propaganda celebrated the victory as a sign of their invincibility. But this brought with it a disadvantage, which would be clearly seen in the battles to come. Hitler and his generals greatly overestimated the capacity of their forces and ignored the mistakes made in combat. France was lost, but the war continued. This is how we come to the end of the video, and we want to ask you, do you think that if the Germans had made different decisions, the war could have ended here? Leave us your answer in the comments box, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.